I teach several courses related to crime and punishment in my job at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, at the Democracy and Justice Studies program, as well as in sociology. In Democracy and Justice Studies, I teach two courses, Freedom and Social Control, which is an introductory course looking broadly at questions of freedom and control, and then the last quarter of that class, I talk about the criminal justice system. And then an upper division course, Criminal Justice Process, which we go through the history of the police, courts, prisons, and look at patterns there. So what's the relationship of criminal justice to social forces? And then in sociology, and this is part of the Democracy and Justice Studies program in the criminal justice emphasis, I teach criminology. And that's the causes of crime. And so there we cover lots of different theories that attempt to explain why individuals engage in crime or why groups of individuals are overrepresented in crime. In my Freedom and Social Control class, I got a email from a student, which is a really important question. It's a terrific question. And recently, I gave a series of lectures in Freedom and Social Control called Crime and Rights. And in criminology, I talked about the demographics of crime. And I looked at class, race, gender, and age, and then looked at the intersections of those. And I made arguments about how to explain, how to understand the overrepresentation of blacks in serious crime, serious conventional crime. And the statistics are stark. Blacks are 13% of the U.S. population. They commit between 36-38% of violent crimes. By violent crimes, we're talking homicide, robbery, etc. In those two categories, murder, homicide, and robbery, more than half of murders and more than half of robberies are committed by blacks. And since crime is overwhelmingly a male activity, particularly serious crime and violent crime, that overrepresentation is attributable to black men, who are around 6% of the population. So those are very dramatic numbers. About a third of aggravated assaults, about a third of burglaries. Burglary is a serious crime. And those facts are disturbing and nonetheless need to be explained. And they need to be explained so that we can figure out why they're happening and try to find a way to reduce the overrepresentation of blacks in crime and reduce crime overall. So we want to figure that out. But they're also important for understanding, for clearing up a confusion that we're hearing today, that the criminal justice system is an expression of systemic racism, that police are targeting blacks for arrest, that courts are convicting blacks and throwing them into prison. So when you look at the prison population and you see that 38% of prisoners there are black, you say, well, blacks are only 13% of the population. The vast majority of prisoners are males. So it looks like the criminal justice system is targeting black males. But then when you recognize that between 36 and 37% of serious crimes, and the most serious crimes, more than half, homicide, murder, and robbery, are committed by black men, you kind of have an explanation for why you see that prison profile. You see why more blacks are being arrested than whites, and why more crimes reported to the police, blacks are identified as the criminal suspects. So the problem then is not because there's calls for, well, if the criminal justice system is racist, if police are racist, let's defund the police, let's depolice. If the prisons are racist, then let's abolish prisons. But if the reason why you see that overrepresentation in arrests and in prisons is because of overrepresentation in serious crime, then those would be the wrong solutions. In fact, you would be to depolice in the context of criminal offending would put people's lives at risk. And in this case, because most victims of black crime are black, putting black lives at risk. So it's important to clarify this. You want to know what's really going on if you want to develop solutions that really work and that don't make the problem worse. Okay. So the student said, so that's the background. The student writes this. I just watched her second lecture on crime and rights, which I found very eye-opening. I was thinking about the poverty statistic and how that doesn't adequately account for the disproportionate rate of crime committed by black men. So I pointed out that there are twice as many poor whites as there are poor blacks, and if poverty lies behind this problem, then, well, you would expect that whites be overrepresented, right? Or at least you would expect that, let's say, if you say poverty lies behind homicide and robbery, if whites are twice as poor as blacks, you would expect to see more than half of homicides, more than half of robberies committed by whites, but you don't see that. Then I got to thinking about residential segregation, something I learned about in another class. We know that both black and white people live in poverty. By the way, this comes from Freedom and Social Control, so my criminology students have heard about residential segregation and the social disorganization theory, which I'm going to get into here. So we know that both black and white people live in poverty, but do poor white people tend to live in the same conditions as poor black people? And then the student talks about, the student is presumably white, and talks about his experience with whites. And I'm from Tennessee, and the rural areas, lots of white poverty, trailer parks, etc. So he's talking about that in here. So I'm not sure if their level of poverty, speaking of poor whites, necessarily matches that of the average poor black person. I've often heard that most poor black people live in the inner city. But in considering statistics correlated with crime, I wonder if residency matters. If you have any input or know any statistics, I'd love to hear it. Okay, great question. Place matters, for sure. Delinquency and crime have always been greater in urban neighborhoods, and that's relatively independent of race and ethnicity. And that means to some extent that if an ethnic or racial group is more likely to appear in an impoverished urban setting, the members of that group are more likely to appear in the crime statistics, more likely to be involved in crime. And just to clarify that, it is possible for crime statistics to not represent the actual amount of crime that's going on, but it's close and always getting better. Now, at the same time, if that ethnic or racial group that was at one point in history overrepresented in crime because they lived in these impoverished neighborhoods, when they are assimilated, move out of these neighborhoods and are assimilated into other parts of the city, so in more affluent, less impoverished parts of the city, and then or move out into the suburbs, then they are no longer overrepresented in crime. So it's not the race or ethnic group that's coming into an urban area that's bringing the crime in. It's the urban impoverished setting, whatever group comes into that setting. And of course, we have these periods of immigration in our history, so we can study this historically. from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe, and they're coming into these ghetto areas, into these impoverished inner city areas, and they are overrepresented in crime. So the assumption might be, well, Italians are just more criminogenic than others. But then when Italians go through the process, they're Italian immigrants, and they become Italian Americans, and then they assimilate out into the suburbs. They're no longer overrepresented in crime. So it's the place, not exclusively, but the place plays a major role. There are ethnic and racial differences that persist over time, or we should say independent of where they're located, relatively independent. And there we're getting into culture effects. I talk about all of that here. Indeed, the fuller answer really takes more time. So in this lecture, I'll present a lengthy explanation for the overrepresentation of blacks in serious crime. But before I turn to that, I want to make several clarifying points. First, the overrepresentation of blacks in serious crime doesn't mean that most blacks engage in serious crime or crime at all. The vast majority of blacks are law-abiding citizens. So when we say that more than half of all homicides are committed by black men, who are 6% of the population, that's an overrepresentation statistically, demographically. That doesn't mean that most blacks, or even a significant number of blacks, are prone to murder. Right? So you have to make that very clear. If you draw that conclusion, then there's some, you should probably think about why you would make that equation, because it doesn't follow. But I need to clarify it, because for some people it doesn't follow. We're talking about aggregate statistics. The emphasis on the word overrepresentation. The overrepresentation of the poor in serious street crime does not mean that most poor people engage in crime. Same thing. Vast majority of poor people are law-abiding citizens. Again, we're talking about aggregate statistics. As a feature of impoverished urban conditions, sort of think about it, serious street crime inevitably involves poor people because it involves the people who are living there. And if blacks are overrepresented in these communities, then serious street crime will find them overrepresented in that crime. So that in itself is not an explanation. It's an obvious expectation, and that's what the data show. So we have to explain this. That's the task. That's the task, to explain it. And I really want to emphasize this, that the overrepresentation of blacks and poor people is not a product of biology or any other inherent or intrinsic characteristics of members of particular races or social class locations. First, race is not a biological reality. It's a social construct. We are socialized to organize the world in racial terms, in the same way that, say, a religious person is socialized to organize their world about spiritual concerns and see, and believe that demons and angels are real. We come to believe these, right? And if, as W.I. Thomas famously said, if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So these beliefs affect our behavior. And second, there's nothing about persons that fate them to the social class in which they find themselves. You're born into social classes. You fall into social classes. You can change your social class location. It's hard, but it can be done. The earliest humans lived in classless society, so clearly class is not a natural condition. This is despite its materiality. It's very different from race. So class is not a social construct. Class is an actual material location where people exist. It's not ideological. You exist in a social class location whether you're aware of it or not. But it's not a natural condition of the species. Now, I've often repeated Henry Thomas Buckle's famous, or infamous, if you will, some people would say it's infamous, 1857 aphorism that, quote, society prepares the crime, the criminal commits it. My criminology students have heard me say that, I'm sure. However, committing crime is a voluntary act. If it wasn't, we couldn't hold the criminal responsible for his actions. So it's an expression of human agency, and we want to be careful. People aren't puppets on strings. We don't want to say, human beings are unthinking animals that are just engaging in this kind of behavior. They make a decision to do that. And so whatever the pressures are that make criminal offending more likely, the criminal still has to choose to break the law. And so when we say that a society prepares the crime, we're talking about conditions conducive to criminal offending for a population. At the individual level, it's more complex. I mean, as I said a moment ago, most black people, most poor people don't commit crime. So crime commission cannot be understood in a straightforwardly deterministic fashion. It's more complicated. So we need a sociological explanation. At the same time, humans are by nature social. We do know this. We are social animals, always have been. We're not the only social animals. Most people don't engage in serious crime because it's in the nature of humans to regard others with empathy. And the empathic circuitry is something that has to be elaborated, developed in the course of socialization. So I have to keep that in mind. Human beings tend to align their actions in a cooperative fashion. It's how we can have society, how we can have community. It's not forced on us. We emerge as fully developed human beings in the context of those social relations. Most people don't want to hurt other people. They may wish to possess something that another person has, but if it involves hurting that person, offending that person, people will go without. In fact, it's hard to, to get, if you want to have revolution and you want to help people recognize who their common oppressors are, who's exploiting their labor, and you say, let's organize and let's take over society so that we can create a more equitable distribution of responsibility and of, the fruits of our labor and so forth and so on. It's very hard to motivate people to do that because it involves seizing the means of production, taking something away from somebody. So there's some natural sense in which we regard other people decently. The laws against stealing exist. Well, before the emergence of the state, there were no laws. We know this as a fact. Law appears at a particular point in history. It would still be regarded, the things that people did in a lawless society would still be regarded as wrong. And so you would have informal social controls, and the person who was offending the group, the morality of the group, the ethic of the group would be subject to control and punishment. So the laws that exist against stealing they reinforce that tendency. More importantly, they're in a politically organized society. They articulate a legal process by which a person may be held accountable for transgressing the expectation. In what manner shall they be held responsible, and so forth. So the reason why a person commits a crime then involves several factors. There are conditions that make criminal offending more likely. We can see this in the aggregate. Social inequality, economic deprivation, these are factors. But they're neither sufficient nor necessary conditions for criminal offending, in that not all deprived people engage in crime, and not all criminals are deprived. Since even deprived people are reluctant to hurt other people, there needs to be in place a belief system that short circuits the normal empathic response. Now, the fact is there's very few people, we talk about psychopaths, right? There are very few people who are born without the capacity for empathy. And as I said before, empathic circuitry needs to be developed, and it can be underdeveloped by inadequate socialization. Not all home environments are, and I'm going to get into the family, it's an important part of this, not all home environments are good for people. Some parents do a very bad job of socializing children and developing out this empathic response. But even then, people with higher levels of sociopathic tendencies, they still develop bonds with other people. They still exhibit compassion. And it's not a lot of evidence that shows that people who engage in criminal activity are necessarily particularly antisocial. So I want to, before moving to the explanation, I want to make this, there's a theory that I want you to know about. Criminology. My criminology students are aware of this theory, and that's Gresham Sykes and David Motz's techniques of neutralization, wherein people learn strategies for suspending their moral obligation, for suspending empathy, that obligation to regard others decently. For example, if a person is taught to see the world in terms of race is first, individuals second, then they'll regard members of other races differently than they'll regard members of their own race. That's the problem of racism, right? So if they're taught, or if they come to believe that their personal circumstances are the fault of another race, that they're oppressed or violated by that racial group, that other racial group, and they see the individuals of that group as personifications, right, of the alleged offending race, then that will diminish their capacity to treat such persons empathically, and it will become easier for them to perpetrate wrongdoing against them. Envy, resentment, frustration, anger, all of these in the context of a meaning system, being pushed by ideology, can provide a rationalization for criminality. Techniques of neutralization can make wrongful actions appear as rightful because the perpetrator deserves what he takes. Right? So if I feel like I'm being underpaid, I might take something from the shop that I work at. It's wages in kind. I deserve this. Am I stealing? Yes, at some level I'm aware of that. But I have a technique, a strategy that allows me to deny my moral responsibility in that case. The victim deserves his fate. He gets what's coming to him. These are rationalizations. And this goes for other forms of us and them thinking. Gang violence, for example, becomes easier when members of a rival gang, become collectively defined as the enemy. And there are rules, by the way, in which in the gang system, it's a very tribal system, there are rules by which people are operating. So it's odd in that way. But killing a member of a rival gang is not like killing members of your own gang. It's not as if empathy is missing in that case, right? It's suspended under certain conditions, depending on who you are regarding, because of the tribal organization of society. One of the things that the Enlightenment, one of the developments under the Enlightenment is the detribalization of society, to try to get to a society of individuals where everybody's equal under the law, so that we regard everybody in the same way. That's Martin Luther King's idea of the colorblind society. We don't regard people in terms of race. We regard them in terms of their individual character. We judge them on that basis. And so that's what we call detribalization. The criminogenic character of the United States in the modern period, this is the argument I'll make, is at its core a problem that's created by the capitalist mode of production. So my analysis is very much Marxist. I want to make that clear because some elements of what I'll say might strike people as sounding conservative, but it's not a conservative argument. We can't reduce the explanation of crime to the mode of production. It's more complex than that. We have this racial character, this ideology of race, racism, these beliefs about race. And race relations play a role. But they're to be explained, both historically and in the current context, in relation to the mode of production, because racism is an ideological strategy to fracture the class consciousness of the proletariat. That's what it does. So if you've got a world that's materially between capitalists and workers, and their objective interests stand opposed, and you want to prevent the majority, the proletariat, the working class, from developing an understanding of that situation and attempt to overthrow the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, then you want to develop a divide and conquer strategy that keeps them disorganized. Get them to think about race instead of class. That way, you have white capitalists and you have white workers, and you can say, hey, we're on the same team, even though they're not, materially speaking. But this is an ideology, so we're on the same team because we're white. Forget about the fact that I'm exploiting your labor. And so all of this means that we have to answer the question by moving across macro, meso, and micro sociological levels. Okay? All right. Now, inner city areas are socially disorganized for all kinds of reasons, and this is with all kinds of effects. The disorganization of these areas are associated with the development of criminogenic subcultures and delinquent traditions. The youth that are socialized in these subcultures and traditions are more likely to engage in delinquency. There they learn the techniques of neutralization and so forth. And later as adults, they are more likely to engage in crime, although the age crime curve shows us that there is some aging out. Social disorganization is disruptive to family and other core social relations, and at the same time, family disintegration. And by disintegration, I mean that if you talk about integration, I mean that as disintegration. It is thwarting the development of family integration. That's what we mean by disintegration. It disrupts the community. So you have this feedback loop where family disintegration disrupts community relations, contributes to the social disorganization of society, which in turn is disruptive to family and other social relations. The criminogenic effect of disorganization is mediated by family structure. And the research is clear on this. Two-parent families represent a powerful countervailing force against the effects of social disorganization, while single-parent households exacerbate these effects. Children from single-parent households are far more likely to wind up committing delinquency and in an adulthood crime, and all kinds of other problems. Poor labor force attachment, marital instability, et cetera, et cetera. There's a reason why gangs exist in urban areas. They fill a vacuum, in part. There are other reasons, but we know that they fill a vacuum left by the disintegration of the two-parent family, especially the absence of a working father. It is significant that gang violence is perpetrated by boys and young men. And this in part explains the extraordinarily high murder rate in those neighborhoods. Mass killing, we often think of the mass killer as a lone white wolf. You hear this idea of the lone wolf walking into a supermarket or walking into a church or something and shooting the place up with a military style weapon. It's the way the media covers it. But most mass killing occurs in impoverished communities on the streets. A lot of it in the context of gang violence, overwhelmingly. So the idea of the white mass killer as the typical mass killer is false. Whites are underrepresented in mass killing. Now, the media gives you can think about why it is the case that the media give you a different perception. But it is at odds with what we know about about mass murder. So the task is to explain the disintegration of the black family, in my view. Why does that happen? Family is immediate. It's in the family that persons are socialized. And if families can't do an effective job of socializing children, it's going to be difficult for them, the children, as they go through life, to exhibit the necessary levels of self-control, self-discipline, resist temptation, to be able to understand that blaming other people for their problems doesn't help them solve the situation they're in, not unless they politically organize with others in order to transform their communities and transform the relationship of their communities to other communities. This is why Marx and Engels felt that the street criminal who engaged in what they call primitive rebellion was really of no use to developing a political revolution. Primitive rebellion, in fact, hurt other working people. And so they had no sympathy for the street criminal. Now, for most of U.S. history, the vast majority of blacks, around 90%, lived in the South. In fact, in 1910, I think it was 89%, around then, of blacks lived in the South, and they lived in stable nuclear and extended family systems. It was, in the early part of the 20th century, it was ethnic groups from Europe who were overrepresented in delinquency and crime. And I say early 20th century, also the latter 19th century. So with mass immigration, you had Europeans coming over. They were moving into these ghetto areas, the slums, and they were the ones who were engaging in delinquency and crime. And the gangs had those characteristics. So Polish gangs, Irish gangs, Italian gangs, and so forth. And those groups over time assimilated into greater America. They integrated with American norms, values. That was accelerated by immigration restrictions in the 1920s. And so you saw the building of the so-called American middle class. So you have all these ethnic groups from Europe. They become hyphenated Americans, and then they move out into the suburbs, and you see they become the white majority. And statistically speaking, underrepresented in criminal offending. Not that they don't commit some crime, it's just much less than their ancestors did when they were first moving through, first living in those inner city conditions. At the same time this was happening, there was what we call the Great Migration. This is the internal migration of blacks in the 20th century, which resulted in blacks moving to the Midwest, Northeast, Western United States. Most blacks still live in the South, about 60%. But today, about 34%, 35% of blacks are roughly split between the Midwest and Northeast, with the remainder in the West. And again, I have those outside of the South. Most blacks living outside the South live in urban areas, about 80%. So the student asked the question, said, I understand this is the case. The student is correct. That is true. There's also internal migration in the South over the 20th century from blacks moving from rural areas into the central cities in southern cities. So perhaps it's not as high as 80%, but it's a majority of blacks live in urban areas in the South. So as a result, over time, the ethnic and racial composition of gangs and the overrepresentation in delinquency and crime shifts from European immigrant populations to blacks, and also to immigrants and their descendants from Mexico and Central America. So there's a different wave that starts later of immigration across the border, southern border. And alongside those demographic changes, and in part driving those demographic changes, are several large-scale successive trends. There's the imperative of capital accumulation. This is why we have to go back to the mode of production. This drove the progressive industrialization of all sectors, what we call the rising organic composition of capital, which disemploys low-skilled labor, requires higher skill levels for workers in what we call capital-intensive, technologically developed, and some people say overdeveloped industries. So that's labor-saving technology, right? Automation, mechanization, and bureaucratic organization, etc. You have the dynamic of suburbanization. It's made possible by the above developments and government action. You saw millions of urban residents leave the cities for the suburbs. So that's all part of that assimilation process. It's constituted wealth migration from the central cities. They were able to leave the central cities. It suggests you have some ability to do so, and you take that wealth with you. So you see a geographic shift in the distribution of wealth. It also meant the loss of stable families, because yes, you have this family disintegration in the what they call the zone of transition in the central cities, but you also, as you're assimilating outward into the working class neighborhoods and eventually out into the suburbs, you see the well, first of all, you have stable families in the context of poverty. Not the zone of transition is associated with family disintegration. Doesn't mean that all families in the zone of transition are. And if they can move out, they will. And so you get a concentration of the disintegrated family problem. And stable families are moving out. And then the more stable families in the working class and out into the suburbs. So you have ethnic and racial integration, you have rising levels of affluence, you have growing expectation and a booming economy, and all of that fueled the civil rights movement. Blacks were saying, people are becoming affluent, they're becoming wealthy, they're leaving these impoverished conditions. There are these structures that are in place that are preventing us, black people, from being able to achieve the American dream. Redlining and Jim Crow segregation and all sorts of de jure rules. Laws that keep segregation in place. And we need to tear down these laws so that we can assimilate, integrate with mainstream America. We need to abolish the color line. During this period, union density was high, about at its peak in the late 50s. About a third of workers were in labor unions. And what that meant is that productivity gains were tied to wages and benefits, wages and compensation. You had collective bargaining. Workers had some political power. And so as the economy was growing, there was shared wealth. This is associated with the period of immigration restriction, supply and demand. So if you have a stable, slow-growing population, it would mean that you would have you'd have a better worker-job match. So native workers would have greater employment opportunities. Now, this rising organic composition of capital is going to create this pressure. And we're also at the same time seeing the expansion of government. So all of this has to be taken in tandem. And in fact, this counteracts the effects of rising structural unemployment, I should say, what we call labor redundancy. So you had a World War II, post-World War II capital labor peace, which incorporated labor unions, normalized labor unions and collective bargaining. Also, that interfered, of course, with class struggle, because if workers are working with the capitalists to get the things they need, if they're able to have a decent life, they're less likely to rebel. And you still had Jim Crow segregation and racism, those formal structures in place. All of this was concealing the fundamental contradiction that I noted just a moment ago, that the rising organic composition was making it increasingly difficult for capitalists to realize the surplus value they were producing, that the workers were producing, to realize that in the form of profit in the market. And so what was happening overall, and it became very noticeable by the end of the 50s, was a fall in the rate of profit. And so the capitalist class had to think about, how are we going to restore high profit levels? That's an important piece of this. Rising organic composition of capital was undercutting the ability of capitalist firms to realize surplus value as profit in the market. And moreover, and in part chasing profit, what you were seeing was capital flight from the Midwest, Western and North Eastern cities to the South. So at the very same time that blacks are migrating out of the South into the Midwest and Northeast, capital is fleeing and coming south. That's the creation of the Rust Belt. And these contradictions became plainly visible, as I said, by 1960. And we saw the fall in the rate of profit was across the transatlantic system. At the time, we should make sure the political question is kept in mind. The Democratic Party represented the hegemonic power since the Great Depression during this time. They're in control of the administrative state, increasingly in control of the culture industry. Today, the Democratic Party, progressive Democrats, are pretty much in control of all of the institutions, political and corporate institutions. So they were the ones who moved to restructure the macroeconomic order. And that meant promoting transnationalization side by side with a new domestic order. It was called the Great Society, the welfare state, right? Which had was in part an elaboration of the New Deal had been established by Roosevelt and the Democrats during the Great Depression and World War II. Now, this changing the macroeconomic system. So first there was the civil rights movement, so you had to deal with that. And that would culminate in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which eliminated institutional racism, made it illegal to discriminate, and dismantled the system of apartheid, of Jim Crow. And of course, residential and occupational segregation continue, and we refer to that as de facto, that in fact not supported by law. And that involves a complex explanation. It's part of it, of course, is a historical inertia of a society that's structured along racial lines for so long, structured by the capitalist class along those lines for so long. Civil rights was actually created because of the increasing unification of the working population under a single consciousness. What could be the new way of dividing the working class? And when you have civil rights and you're integrating society, well, you need to shift the story. You can say, well, we don't, maybe we don't want integration. Maybe assimilation is racist itself. Maybe we want to have a multicultural society. And this is not a new argument. It goes back to the beginning. In fact, the progressive Democrats back in the beginning of the 20th century made an argument for what they call cultural pluralism. The intellectuals, cosmopolitan elites in the central cities who are working hand in glove with the industrialists who wanted to keep immigration going because they were able to super exploit that labor, drive down wages for native workers by expanding the labor pool and so forth. So the progressive movement's always been about this. They represent corporate power, corporate governance. That's what progressivism is. That meant suppressing what we call populism in the Democratic Republican tradition, Democratic Republican sentiments, the basis upon which the country was founded. So the emergence of state capitalism, corporate governance dovetails with the suppression of populism and promoting progressive technocratic policy. And so once you had this crucible of the 1960s in which all these issues of race and so forth were in consciousness and people were dealing with it, the very next year, so 1964 is the Civil Rights Act, the very next year, the country was open to mass immigration. And this was a conscious economic strategy. So this was under the Democrats, taxes were slashed so that corporations could have cash to start offshoring production. So this is globalization or transnationalization of production. And it has two facets. One is you take production to where the cheap labor is overseas. If you can't do that, then you bring cheap foreign labor to the country and work them here. So globalization is both offshoring and immigration. So you had the outmigration of capital to foreign lands and the immigration of foreign labor to the United States. All of this in an attempt to break the fall in the rate of profit, to restore high profit levels. Thus, the problem of state capitalism and bureaucratic collectivism, will be compounded by aggressive globalization. So you have promoting tax cuts, offshoring. So you have firms globe-trotting for cheap labor, supplies overseas, transnationalization of capital, and then the concomitant global legal policy affiliations and structures radically transformed the financial system during this period. The mass importation of cheap, skilled, unskilled labor into the United States, the ramping up of the military-industrial complex, that was foreign intervention, right, in order to, keep and make the world safe for capital injection. And of course, we came out of World War II, and much of the world was devastated. The United States emerged as the world hegemon, and so a lot of the wealth that we were experiencing was because of we were rebuilding the world. And when you expose native workers to cheap foreign labor at home and abroad, this weakens unions. So they drove union density down from around 1/3 in its peak in the late 1950s to less than 1 in 10 workers today. That enlarges the size of the surplus labor population. It increases unemployment, suppresses wages, and breaks then that historic alignment of wages and compensation with productivity I talked about. You see corporate profits soaring, small businesses struggle, smaller corporations struggle, and then you see rising income inequality. It's very, very dramatic. Well, let's go back and consider that blacks have been displaced because of these patterns of internal migration. Their migration into these impoverished inner city conditions, the ghettos. So they're already displaced and disemployed by earlier trends, right? So low-skilled labor is replaced by machines. They didn't have access to educational, technical, resources to learn skills. You saw the progressive expansion of the welfare state under the Great Society that materially supported populations who were idled by these trends. And they tended to be disproportionately black. And there is a link between government support, welfare, and family disintegration. In fact, it is not inaccurate to describe the inner city neighborhoods today as custodial states in which idle populations are managed and controlled. They're disproportionately black, increasingly Hispanic. You have a vastly expanded criminal justice apparatus. And what is it doing? Well, it's managing the criminogenic fallout of the macroeconomic restructuring that was undertaken to benefit the capitalist class and its functionaries in the administrative state. Right? And so if you have overrepresentation of people living in these impoverished inner city areas, if they're overrepresented in serious street crime, and then you create a demographic change in who exist in those communities, then members of those groups will become overrepresented in serious criminal offending, going back to what I said at the very beginning. Then if you add to that mass immigration, the importation of cheap labor, including cheap skilled labor, if you add to that the offshoring of work, taking factories outside of the United States, enlarging structural unemployment, enlarging what Marx and Engels call the industrial reserve, what's the predictable consequences of that in light of those demographic and geographical changes? Which group would you predict would be most detrimentally impacted by that? And the answer is Black Americans. And this is why it's so important to make sure that people understand the criminal justice system is not operating on the basis of race. It's operating on it's a class control system. It manages the fallout. So if you have a job and you work, it's the labor system that controls you. But when you are thrown out of work, when you're a member of the industrial reserve, has to be another control system, and that's the criminal justice system. And if blacks are disproportionately impacted by these changes, then one would expect that they would become overrepresented in the criminal justice system through the mechanism of overrepresentation in serious criminal offending. So place matters. It's much more complicated than that. Place not only geographically, but also place in the mode of production. Now, these trends have, as I've already alluded to, there's devastating impact on the American family. Single-parent households are associated with greater levels of behavioral, what we call conduct disorders, emotional problems, delinquency, high school dropout, and adulthood. Individuals who had these problems exhibit lower levels of educational attainment, family stability, labor force attachment, income and wealth, mental and physical health, and greater involvement in crime and violence. The United States is remarkable among advanced industrial countries for its high levels of crime. It has the largest proportion of children living in single-parent homes. Since the 1960s, we've seen a fourfold increase in the number of unmarried parents. Single parents are disproportionately black and female. Blacks represent about 3 in 10 single-parent households. And now keep in mind the demographic share here of the black population. Today, more than half of black children live in single-parent female-headed households, compared to 1 in 4 Hispanics, a bit less than 1 in 7 whites, and less than 1 in 10 Asians, much less than 1 in 10. Overall, 60% of blacks live in single-parent homes. Some of those are headed by fathers, which, incidentally, the research is starting to show are less likely to join gangs and be involved in criminal offending. So the criminogenic effect of single parenting is mediated by inequality and gender. So problems identified above are greater in solo families headed by mothers living in impoverished inner city areas. So what we're finding is that blacks are becoming an increasing proportion of the urban poor, as they were. Progressive Democrats were pursuing economic policies that devastated the working class, and then in particular devastating to black Americans. At the same time, they're constructing a custodial state to manage what Marx and Engels call the industrial reserve. The traditional values of family, community, nation, which were the emphasis on assimilation, which had shaped the traditional civil rights movement. Remember, Martin Luther King and others argued that true, we don't have a colorblind society, but that's the goal. His dream was that one day we'd live in a country that did not judge people by the color of their skin, but the content of their character, to build a colorblind society, to realize the American creed, which, despite slavery and race slavery and racial segregation in our history, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, the principles upon which those are founded are essentially colorblind. We have the people, and it's very constrained at first, and the story of America is the enlargement of the people, including more people in different racial groups, women, etc., to realize in practice the ideals articulated by the American creed. And when Martin Luther King was shot, it was in the context of a poor people's campaign. He was focusing on helping poor people, regardless of race. So there was this traditional civil rights movement and its desire that the institutions of society are open to all races, that all races integrate with the American creed of individualism, see people as people first, as individuals first. But what happens is this is replaced by a new civil rights paradigm. At the moment that happens, now the ideas of assimilation and integration are portrayed as racist. The American creed is racist. It's no longer these ideals that we want to realize and practice by breaking down racial barriers. Now the idea is, not only the United States, the West represents white supremacy. Now you may be thinking, well, crime, violent crime, certainly not over the last year. It's been, I don't know if you know this, we're at decades where after a very long period of decline in violent crime, 30, 40 years of decline, we're now seeing the largest increases in violent crime that we've seen in 30, 40 years. Why is that happening? Well, I'll submit to you it's happening because of depolicing, because of the reluctance of police officers to enforce the law, because they're worried, this is called the Ferguson effect, of being accused of racism. Why did crime go down during those 30 or 40 years? Well, it was going up dramatically in the 60s. It continued to go up. And the United States governments, the various governments in the states and at the federal level, they organized this at the federal level, put more police on the streets, put judges who were Get Tough, wrote Get Tough on crime legislation, built more prisons, and we went from about 150 to 200,000 prisoners in 1970 to 2.3 million prisoners today. Most of those in state prisons. And so did it have an impact on crime and violence? Yes, it did. Is there a better way of dealing with crime and violence than arresting people and locking people up? That would be the goal. Because once you get to the point where you have to arrest and lock up so many people to have a safe society, that indicates a deep problems that are going on in your society. Now, of course, you want that public safety. Nobody wants to be the victim of crime. So you have to have that control function. But wouldn't it be great if we could understand why we got to a point where crime and violence were so bad that we had to respond with such a massive criminal justice apparatus? What didn't have to happen. You're not going to solve the problem of crime and violence by depolicing, defunding the police, by abolishing prisons. That's not going to solve the problem if the conditions that are causing crime are still present. So we need to think about this problem far more deeply. We need to understand racism as an ideology that's used to divide working class and create this politics of resentment, going back to the techniques of neutralization, where you see every member of a particular group as the reason why, because it's the group is the reason why your personal circumstances are not as good as you'd like. And so by talking about race, we hide the fact that there are very wealthy blacks and very poor whites. We have this ridiculous notion that a homeless white person enjoys some sort of privilege, whereas a wealthy black person is somehow oppressed by white supremacy. And who does that benefit? Benefits the wealthy. Benefits those who have money, power, are able to shape the trajectory of history.